Hello everyone, today we introduce Tang Chinese warfare for our Chinese and sort of enemies of China warfare series in just like, of course, greater outlook given the width of the topic. Tang China is remembered in the history of the country as one of the most prosperous periods. Its military was definitely apt to the name, even though this dynasty lasting between 618 and 906 AD had this major up and then essentially a longer down, which also the quality of its military began to decay. In any case, we are also, as you can see from the correlate of pictures I uploaded here, in disposal of an overwhelming iconography, to say the least. This is normally the case with most of Chinese warfare, a bit less concerning the one of its enemies, at least in some regions. For the rest, there is a lot of, especially Turkic warfare, that is, of course, Mongolian later as well, that is heavily documented from China, so much so that we cover at some point Seljuk warfare also from the Chinese perspective, not just the, say, the Crusader one in the West. Tang China is, again, I will try to make things simple as hopefully effective, comes politically, historically, and culturally after 3 years and a half of Chinese disunion or dissolution. The Chinese Empire had definitely undergone a major crisis after the Han period that fundamentally mirrors in many ways what happened to the western end of Eurasia as well. The Tang were preceded in a recompaction of China by the Sui dynasty that had finally succeeded in recompacting power once again. However, this was short-lived, at least in terms of Sui control. At the turn of the 7th century, China was in fact again plunged into turmoil. The reasons of this naturally being overall complex, but it seemingly had to do with systemic corruption, instability, some general governmental failure that in many ways, especially if we look at the period, just the other day we made a video about Heraclius and the brusque contraction, to say the least, that the Byzantine Empire had, if we want to make a comparison between Rome and China. Also Islam spawned, but sort of fragmented after the first expansion, was invested by a deep crisis that we call in the West, at least the one of late antiquity, the end of this period, of this era of overall stability, and characterized by a great deal of material poverty, agricultural shortcoming. It's difficult to draw a comparison like this with China that usually follows between East and West, actually the parallel with Europe, because of the splendor traditionally associated to the Tang era, especially again as objectively so compared to the rest, right, of the Chinese history during the period. However, it should be pointed out, as we did at the beginning, that also this system faced an important crisis towards the later period, which actually was, to a degree, a moment of revival in the West, the second half of the 8th century. At least there is a new crisis in the late the second half of the 9th. So there are some similarities, as a matter of fact, there that do allow, also considering the actual quality and general aspect of the military, with an interesting comparison. If anything, because as we will learn now, we witness in China, of course, a rise of cavalry in general importance, and also the affirmation, in fact, of a more aggressive one. And if we look at the Tang world at large, overlapping, say, not necessarily with the Carolingian era, especially at the beginning. It's really another time, but being there some growth, some expansion, or at least bulky stability at points. And in Europe, we can find part of the same during the Carolingian era, and we compare, for example, the arms development, etc. There are some interesting connections, also in as much as the social background is concerned. Because again, there are historiographical cliches to some degree. For example, we will encounter now the militia system that was called like this historiographically for a certain part of the Tang army that, for this reason, by Western commentators was intended as militia in, say, the English sense of essentially unprofessional troops. Vice versa, we have this overwhelming sense of splendor, mostly deriving from the great amount of course, of art, of iconography. We can also, in fact, admire here, but being produced by a very oligarchic system at the end of the day, and so not necessarily just China would have had resources in absolute terms, but not necessarily reflecting the relative ones. And my impression is actually that during this century there was a great deal of, in fact, continuity with also the trend that had characterized the previous period. Meaning that the broader contraction of Eurasia did strike also the Tang dynasty in the early 7th century, which is the moment of its peak, but not necessarily the one of an absolute wealth, right? So political recompaction, unification, very important. I made a video recently commenting on the historian question of why did not sort of say the Roman Empire reunite. That was the premise. That in fact highlighted this tendency to believe that just because one country is under a single polity's rule, it should sort of be necessarily just a better working system. And aside from the early grandeur of the Tangs, we will realize that in many ways the same dynastic power shipwrecked the state. Given also the general premise of the obvious decentralization, provincialization of power towards, like already starting from the 8th century, right? And always, that the same goes for the Sui dynasty, like the sense that the nobility was in many ways just very greedy and wanting to entrench itself mostly into the local seigneuries and not really contributing to the whole, that China really lent quite advantageously itself to consolidate power through would have brought to this ultimate or recurrent instability. There is an almost Arthurian parallelism drawn between Li Shimin and the general capacity to sort of rise himself in this moment of further instability at the end of the Sui dynasty as well. Li Shimin would be known as the Emperor Tang Tai Zong. There are also different transliterations and phonetics that I will probably be butchering nevertheless. Was a bit like the fully restoring force that after his father manages to bring together China and to also expand further in the west, in the north, to stabilize its wide frontier and subjugating the various Turco-Mongolian peoples in its outskirts. Li Shimin conquered every other contestant to Chinese power, founding de facto the Tang dynasty in 618. Under the Tangs, China managed to extend her empire to further limits than any other dynasty, even the Hans. This also, in my opinion, derives from the general exhaustion of Eurasia in the steppes, so that even though China was partly suffering the same dynamic, still like more concentrated absolute wealth in this large basin was able to overrun most of the resistance in its outskirts. Now, naturally, this was never, again, a direct control of these places, but it was particularly relevant to give new boost, especially to trade. In fact, this was exalted to a height never before known. Again, in my opinion, not much because the Tangs had invested particularly in that, but simply because with brutal and effective force, they could simply control most of the strategic choke points in Eastern Eurasia, in Central Asia, and allowing for this never-ending stream of caravans traversing the Silk Route, carrying Chinese exports throughout the known world. This is also a period in which, for example, the Chinese and the Islamic civilization myth, at some point, China does draw also from it in the later centuries. It seems that Arab artillerists were particularly sought after, even in the very technologically advanced China at large. But again, never underestimate the overall material poverty and also all the, the particular value, right, of this precious technicians in for the sake of this example, that could become such a, in fact, preciously sought after resource even across continents. By 733 AD, the Tang imperial census reported 43 million people living within the Tang Empire, which gives you a dimension of this, in fact, enormous demographic and agricultural pool that did not have actually an overwhelming surplus, but for the time being was able to maintain stability on such a wide area. Let's talk about the Tang army and military organization. So, when you look at the fundamentals of this force, we look at similarly regimental force to the one we noticed in a recent video about the Byzantine army organization of roughly the same period. You have 6 field armies known as the Chun. These were the key forces concentrated in the neuralgic centers of the empire to maintain stability in the respective basins. They were meant, in fact, to act as full field armies, so with a major or regional strategic capacity and, of course, a complete tactical autonomy. These armies were divided into 2 wings each, the left of which was the senior and the right, each consisting of 3 armies in turn. This likely reflected a deployment on 3 battle lines of the entire force when fielded. Each wing was commanded by a general, the left wing commander being senior. A single Chun was commanded by a chief of staff and a cavalry commander, the Ssu-ma, completing the host's command positions. The Tang military was divided naturally in the 2 main arms, cavalry and infantry, each of which was organized into regiments. Each army headquarters had both cavalry and infantry forces. The main organizational difference, however, was that cavalry was brigaded into divisions, while infantry into regiments. The reason why this would happen is seemingly like the greater emphasis that we will learn now that the Tang army, like most early high medieval armies at this point, that's also very similar to Europe in many ways, on cavalry, and in this case mirroring the greater unity of command required by the cavalry in order to operate. In other words, the mounted arm was more punchy. Again, we will see now there are plenty of indicators for that. It was the upper arm Infantry was very important. This is not a time or a space in which infantry does not matter, does not count. There are also ups and downs regarding the same cavalry quality. In any case, infantry has tendentially a secondary role compared to cavalry that the tanks especially use in a very smashing, punching capacity. Around the mid-5th century, infantry organization allowed for regiments of 800 to 1200 men. The main body of infantry was called, at least this is translated, of course, into the militia, right? Which had altogether something like 600 regiments, which if you make, say, the simple equation, say an average infantry regiment being 1,000 men, would have counted 600,000. This is a bit ideal. It's really unlikely that there would have really been an official amount of troops of that kind. This is what has a bit, so probably drawn historiography into some impasse, because from one side you want to recognize, of course, the Tang state capacity to regulate, to arm, to supply such apparently permanent, or at least semi-permanent, or at least mobilizable troops, not differently from the Limitane, say, would have existed in the late Roman Empire, that tended, however, to melt away. So this so-called militia is as qualitative as this broader number of regiments is reduced as a whole, because it's really unthinkable that there were 600,000 sort of professional infantrymen in Tang China. It doesn't make any sense. These were more like local regimental forces that were, again, the basic, at least, unit that the Tang military relied on, especially in terms of military administration, in order to control the territory, right? And some of these regiments would have been scattered, it would have been dependent on the local army headquarters, but it could have been decentralized all around to control a province or another. Naturally, the local communities would contribute to maintain these regiments, so there was just a bit so much at this point in the early Middle Ages to squeeze like the population in order to maintain its forces. It's likely that these troops were really framed, regimented in this unit, but they would have had some part-time job of sort, even some rota system, and that most of them would have just served thus as garrison to deter rebellions, revolts locally. The cavalry, as we've seen, had a greater status and importance. These were just like the more tendentially professional forces, and they varied greatly. Of course, we can imagine across China the kind of diversity will be proper now. In any case, the aforementioned divisions would have counted 4,000 men. The regiments were still making these divisions up were between 500 and 1,000 horsemen. There were also squadrons of 200 and 300. This seems to also hint at the fact that there often was also within the aforementioned field armies a sort of greater reliance on cavalry to begin with, because this segmentation would suggest some triple battle lines depth by the regiments on the field. In fact, it seems that these squadrons were individually so relevant to be directly subordinated to the army command, at least at times. They would have still been part of the regiment within the broader hierarchy, but these bodies of few hundred horsemen would have been the basic force that could have been tasked with different duties and roles at the normal also tactical level from one side, but also, as we said before, the provincial one, right? It's, again, a very vast dominion that is mostly controlled, as always, in a decentralized fashion at the end of the day, and the various commanders would have been provided with this retinues. Still, of course, referring to a central command, at least in a single region, right? That could be, however, very vast. The Imperial Guard, of course, existed, providing 12 regiments, 6 cavalry and 6 infantry, which also tells you how important, of course, the former arm really was. These were the emperor bodyguards that would accompany him on campaign. 3 regiments protected the crown prince. What we have looked at now are fundamentally the regular units. And again, historiography has a bit to emphasize how, drilled and well equipped and whatever this so-called militia overall was. But if you understand, even just from a strictly, concrete point of view, just by the extension of the Tang Empire to the number of the population, etc., these were just the bare minimum, as in most civilizations it's really the case, especially in this time of pretty strong shortcomings, both materially and morally, to maintain control of the population, right? And routinely, grouping them to launch campaigns here and there. We will see it now. So naturally, this was a very functional military per se, but of course, it had a quality ranging from elite to real militia, levy of some sort. Then there were lots of foreign auxiliaries, right? That were not, of course, part of the Tang army, but they were essentially the various client states of China at this point. In 617, for example, the western Zhuge, the Tanai tribe specifically, these were Turks at large, as you understand, were allied with Li Shimin in his bid for power that we will see later during the wars against the Sui Chinese that also had their own auxiliaries. Between 630 and 682, the eastern two Zhuge allied with the Tang to fight the western one. The two Zhuge are nothing but the Great Turkic Khaganate. They're the Gök Turks, and as you know, they are split also in the eastern and western part. We will see now how the Chinese managed to subdue both. These Turks are very important as far as the Tang campaigns up to the Tarim Basin, where the Tangs managed to subject, in fact, the Kuchan state, are concerned. I made a video about Kuchan warfare. These were essentially Tokharian city-states that had survived in this basin all along, the foothills of the surrounding mountains, Kucha being the most important of them, and being eventually overrun by the Turks, but also manipulated by the Tangs. It was an obvious policy and strategy to use Turks while fighting that far west. It tells you, of course, how China could simply not, say, control the Tarim Basin directly. They needed these client rulers, and of course they were backed and supported by consistent forces in order to essentially freeze the situation, especially along the Silk Road, so that China would gain the upper hand over this enormous basin, the Tarim one, leading up to essentially the western Eurasia, Sogdiana, and so the various markets in further west. During at this point, you have the Muslims almost reaching up to that, but say reaching Persia, having also capacity to head towards India. We will see now how part of these auxiliaries on the Tang's behalf, did make raids into India. Remember, Tang China reaches the greatest geographical extent in the country's history. All right. In any case, in 644, the Uyghur to Chu also allied to fight the Kuchen. In 649, 1,200 Tibetan armored cavalry and 7,000 Nepalese infantry were called in to fight King Alanashan of India at Chhapra on the Ganges River, as we were pointing out before. I made a video about Tibetan warfare. If you're interested in that, you've seen actually what kind of mixed relations existed between China and this country at the time that had a hell of a feudal military culture. By the way, in any case, of course, China was so ecumenic that it was able to move these peoples according to the circumstances, and a good raid into the Ganges Valley, it's always something you want to appreciate from Nepal around there. Remember the Turco-Mongol background of these Chinese auxiliaries, that of course is quite predatory in many ways. Migration era is never over in Central Asia. So in 617 we have a list, let's say, of the some forces, some officials in the command organization for the Tang state. We see the Duke of Tang, which is a sort of generalissima. Then you have the Duke of Lung-hsi Li Chien-ch'eng, that is the senior of the left wing. The right wing is the Duke of Tun-huang Li Shimin. Then you have Pei Chi, that is the chief of staff, and Liu Wen-ching, that is the cavalry commander, the aforementioned Ssu-ma. And that's also how we resume the aforementioned organization for the Tang army's organization. Then there was a multiplicity of units that we can more or less identify as either picked ones, special forces, or just temporary corps. Some of them would have a semi-permanent characteristic. It was completely normal to have different units substituting others, for example, as we've seen at the local, provincial, regimental level, especially after civil wars, invasions, etc. We find, for example, Li Shimin's bodyguard of 100 armored cavalry that would have been just a picked elite of this essentially cavalry company of sort. Other units were known as the Flying Horse, referring to horse archery, an armored cavalry. And the U-men, a squadron of 300 armored cavalry lancers with specific shock charge functions. What's interesting about them is that at some point they would have existed as independent units, something just produced by politics, of course, rather than a pre-regressed military organization, and of course reflecting the degree of oligarchic and private capacities that the Chinese establishment maintained in this wide dominion. We also know, of course, the Tangs to have been provided with significant polyaesthetic capacities. We know of siege artillery, including numerous large catapults in the, say, Hellenic term of the world, that is to say, some throwing engines that could pierce enemy armor and beyond. Some of these were known as large, quote, multiple crossbows in Chinese, which would have, in fact, equated to probably some kind of large ballista, capable, apparently, of discharging 8 bolts in repeating fire at a range of almost 400 meters. We will make other videos, naturally, about all these marvels of technology on another occasion. However, consider the general scientific background of China that apparently during the Tangs was run by some sort of rationalistic philosophy based also on this interesting mathematical and engineering interests, at least from an elite perspective. Then, of course, we're still talking about the High Middle Ages, but China was, again, significantly advanced. It had a long tradition, also of military engineering. Speaking of training, and so assessing a bit more closely what the quality of the various components of the Tang armies was about, we have to make an important distinction between the properly picked units we will see now and the wide majority that were in fact conscripts. When we have talked about the infantry regiments, the cavalry divisions, well, most of these were actually conscripts, right? The Tang army basically, and that's also how we know about the overall force, was maintained by a state that allowed, at least for resources to be collected by the local officials in order to maintain this fixed bodies of troops. But they were fundamental levies, right? There was also a stark divide in general, understood not just in military quality, but also in a, of course, societal and cultural sense between cavalry and infantry. In fact, it does seem that in front of the former, the latter was, considered a pretty scarce thing. Cavalry was considered elite to begin with. It's like what you see in the West during the same time. Especially in the sedentary realities, then of course, as we've seen, there is the French, the steppe, the Turco-Mongol horse archers. That's another story, regardless of their heavily armored elites. But say in the West, when you see someone fighting on horseback, it's essentially some quality force, and we do not have sort of a better knowledge of lighter type of cavalry. In China, there would have been, we will see it now, some more mounted archery philosophy compared to the West, but at large, like it's shock cavalry, and as such, it requires all a particular background, training, technique, and so it can be considered elite and employed, as we've seen just in the difference between cavalry and infantry organization, in a much more dynamic way compared to infantry. Meaning that, of course, the latter lacked the consistency of the cavalry force per se. Because of this cavalry-oriented philosophy, the infantry of the Tang seldom ever left the farmer soldier status. So also the aforementioned regimental infantry was in many ways just some military colonists of sorts that was so also mostly in social terms, meaning that he had sort of more privileges compared to the rest of the peasantry, would have been mostly serfs, in virtue of his potential function of having to serve with a basic equipment and generic training in a functional unit, but something you could not really expect more than much from. In fact, as we will learn later, looking at the main battles of the period, it was the heavy cavalry that won Li Shimin's great victories, such as at the most famous battle of Wulao, that we'll again see later, where really the Tang cavalry smashes into the Xia opponents, like butchering tens of thousands of them in the pursuit. The discipline, esprit de corps, and tactical expertise of the heavy cavalry was provided in such a way that it really highlights the aggressiveness of the Tang military training. The horsemen had the lion's share of Tang's tactics. Indicative in this sense is also the onomastics of some units, for example the leapers and the agitators. These were admittedly elite shock troops used by the Tangs that really show a bit this restless behavior. By the way, if you've noticed in some of the pictures uploaded here, you find some beast warrior headgear, some fierce game skin, right, that resembles, remember, we are essentially in the early Middle Ages, considering all the context with the Turks, with their wolf totemic symbolism, etc., would have actually been a thing in China. It's not just like a European thing, or just say a migration or Viking era one. It had, as you know, always existed. And even in such a civilized military culture, you of course find the persistence of this much more primitively traditional ethos that is well embodied by some of these Chinese, especially elite units. When we look at the overall quality of Tang training over time, we notice, however, that this enormous military machine was, again, very much like a territorial one. As we've seen, most of these forces were conscripts. It's not really different from the Byzantine thematic armies. It's not like they were bad, right? But they were very much anchored to their own provincial positions, and so there wasn't this overwhelming capacity to mobilize, if not with a massive concentrated effort that the great Chinese basin can afford under the Tangs at that point, but always with sort of relatively modest forces that we can, in fact, appreciate from single battles, the accounts of which would tend to exaggerate the overall numbers, displaying, in fact, say, contained figures, and therefore mirroring a quite carefully handled sources that were probably like the largest they could field at a time. A decline in the later period, especially problems actually start already from the 8th century. There are major civil wars. Now we will not descend into the political issues. There were other dynasties within, the other branches within the same Tangs to emerge. A bit the same story in China, different centers of power gaining more preeminence. However, this state of decay accelerates during the 9th century. There are numerous rebellions that heavily damage the overall quality of the army. All, again, these preciously controlled demographic and agricultural resources are wasted, destroyed, etc. So we realize that, for example, cavalry training was in great part lost or left to some sort of more local handling. The Chinese looked to their farmer soldiers for support, but they were essentially not capable of having it materialized. So the back of the army was effectively broken by the end of the Tang era. You can look at parallelisms in history with this, but again, this is what I would like to stress. While in Europe you have essentially the making of Carolingian cavalry during these centuries, and even when the Carolingian Empire breaks down, paradoxically, the quality of the local cavalry, because of the further entrenchment into ever more powerful seigneuries, from an individual standpoint of the single millis, is happening. In Tang China, you have, again, this initial period of glory, of enormous glory, as we'll learn now, that, however, reflects mostly still a tendentially statal attempt to control the resources of all China that had also not been really controllable in a unitary sense from centuries. Thus, it's not like the Tang could make miracles. This statal reality was, in Marxian terms, you could call a superstructural thing. If you do not really have much of a moral force and cohesion to keep them together, an ability to channel these forces, also to tame, as we've seen, other rivals all around. These forces will start turning against one another, and the very fabric and skeleton of this military China-wide is going to dissolve. And this is essentially what goes on. So at that point, even the capacity to inform further your military on the basis of some almost ancient era style of subtle dirigism basically ends, because there hadn't really been all the resources of the world to do so, even in the very splendid and sung Tang era. Naturally, we are aware more or less of the tactics that the Tang military employed throughout its history. There is a great deal of warfare against the nomadic enemies of the empire. Against these, the Tang sought to capture their flocks and occupy their wells rather than to fight or to pursue a much faster foe across the steppes. This is something very similar to what we've seen, for example, very different contexts, both in time and place and climatic areas, but I don't know how the Assyrians coped with the Arab raiders, right? You have really to deny them any logistical point d'appui, which in the steppes feels really like, I don't know, trying to empty the sea with a bucket in a way, but in fact those nomads are not really faring that well. This is a post-migration era period. There is an overwhelmingly traumatic and nightmarish, again, material poverty and also moral shortcoming. So the Tang can concentrate forces effectively to knock the enemy out of a cornerstone, of a noses, of a pass, of something that would confer these peoples any kind of protection or supply to their flocks that they depend on. And in fact, there aren't too many places where you can simply go to graze, right? Fresh pastures are an incredible precious resource. Of course, Tang policy and diplomacy would try to turn all these groups against one another. It's not really different from what Constantinople was doing towards its steppes neighbors. By setting one tribe against another, a fighting force could lose all cohesiveness and crumble before the slightest Chinese opposition. This could happen in multiple directions. Of course, the nomads living closer to China were sort of the more dangerous, but also the ones that could be more directly threatened by the Tang military. Otherwise, like backing a group or another out there in the steppes and just spending those people's energies into destroying one another would indirectly shelter China from further issues. Kadir Khan, at the head of some Gök-Turk forces, entered China in 622 with allegedly 150,000 men, a bit too much. In any case, it was really a large force. The Chinese managed to subdue this massive force. It would have included also lots of non-fighting forces and chattel piecemeal. We will see this better when we will look at the two Chue, as they were called in China. For the rest, Chinese tactics at this point against more conventional enemies, that is essentially mostly the same Chinese, favored pinning down the foe frontally with, as we've seen, a pretty robust advanced fighting force of heavy cavalry, but at the same time working their way around the enemy's flanks with same mounted troops. This, as we will see later, was, for example, done against the Koreans that were quite courageous in defense, but also less than the Chinese, most of the time at least, in open field. Plus, the Koreans did not really have much cavalry, which was also part of the reason here. They were more exposed to Chinese tactical mobility. They would maintain some heavy cavalry as a mobile reserve with which they could counter, if anything, this outflanking maneuver, but not really preventing it to begin with. Right? So I made a video about Korean warfare during this period, and we've seen how actually tough they were, but as you know, you can be tough, but not particularly complex or articulated. The Tang were not above any deed if it would ensure victory. Of course, there was an enormous military experience, as we were recalling before. There was a lot of general education of the Tang commanders through mostly a nobiliar upbringing, continuous involvement in military training. As we will see in the Battle of Kansu especially, there could be, however, very creative ways of distracting the enemy and gaining victory. Naturally, Chinese historiography is a bit more fairy tale, like a bit more based on philosophic example than actual sort of Western criticism and analysis, but it's also pretty advanced, so we actually know a lot for, again, the times and places. China really provides us with a lot of tremendous insight. As a commander, Li Shimin ranks with the greatest generals and also rulers of all time. As you know, he is considered one of the greatest Chinese emperors to have ever existed. He opened this phase of prosperity, and he really employed a number of stratagems that managed to cover him in glory. Right, a veritable triumph was bestowed upon him after the Battle of Wulao. He really embodied the recompaction of China at this point. Some evidence about these stratagems is anecdotal. For example, displaying more standards that units in his army to trick the enemy into believing that essentially it would be more forces than the one that actually were there. And you can also wonder how effectively you can succeed in this, also for how long, and especially, you know, by which degree. Especially in large-scale combat, it's a bit difficult to simply hide what kind of forces you have or don't, right? Nevertheless, if you're able to manipulate your enemy from a psychological point of view, well, that's basically what all warfare is about. So some of these ruses would have really occurred. At the Battle of Wulao, there was also, as we will see, a great deal of numerical disparity. Yet, Li Shimin was able to split force even at that point, leading this tiny squadron out of position and confusing and demoralizing the enemy, showing, as we were saying before, how crucial these contained but still elite cavalry forces could really change a lot on these early medieval Chinese battlefields, especially with this prompt charge, right, carried out by, in fact, very highly trained and motivated forces that would oblige at that point the enemy just to react because of the concentrated force. The Tang military covered itself in glory also as far as, for example, logistical feats were concerned. When you look at Hannibal's crossing of the Alps, well, you can't make the parallelisms with the Tang general Cao Hsien-chin, who in 747 crossed the Pamirs while he was on a mission to attack the now enemy Tibetans, leading a force of 10,000 cavalrymen. Consider also the region, and again the fact that the Chinese tended also to fight with the kind of troops of the area that were largely, again, feudal and also nomadically influenced. Across this enormous area, just we're talking in length, just as a journey, this incredibly tough terrain in the wilderness, a march of over 1,100 kilometers that would shock, in fact, his adversaries that didn't even know he was coming, but especially across the Pamir mountain range at Barrowgill. We're talking about an elevation of 3,800 meters, and the Glacier d'Arco, an elevation of over 4,700 meters. Right, the Tang forces descended finally after this veritable inferno of ice and cold into the Yazin Valley, where the Tibetano-Arabic army, interestingly enough, was shocked to see this Tang Chinese force appearing from their rear. It's almost like Napoleon at Ulm, except also with terrifying terrain conditions, and of course at this point a millenary disadvantage, like in terms of art of war development, that is really one of the greatest feats ever pulled off from a strategical and logistical point of view. So when we look at these Tang forces, we realize, first of all, an elite. We can't think in general, a bit like in the West, really, 1/10 of the entire fielded units that are per se also just the ones coming out of a selection, out of a rota system, for example, but only really 1/10 being truly elite, armored cavalry. Then you would have some other, maybe, double time for making a triad, essentially, of unarmored cavalry, as softer, lighter cavalry is put in this way. Then a pretty solid numerical bulk, let's say half of conscripted, poorly trained spearmen and bowmen. And, of course, depending on the situation, some sort of guard units, right? So, in that case, not just cavalry, there could be also trained armored infantry was a thing in the Tang military, and a bit bigger from a numerical point of view, tribal auxiliary unarmored cavalry, or of course any other type coming from these peoples, armored cavalry as well, or skirmishers, depending on the circumstance. So it's not really such a different type of army compared to, say, the Byzantine one, if you look at the same period. As we observed in other videos, however, China being a bigger system, more unitary one, the military system of which was also statally dependent on, routinely undergoes systemic shortcomings. Right, so if we have seen at the beginning of the period 600 regiments available, we apparently have only 54 at the end of the period, which is just 54,000 men for a population that was, as we've seen, 1,000 times larger. Now, we should, of course, go a bit more in depth to assess this, to evaluate this. Likely there were, of course, less semi-permanent forces available from properly the Tang dynasty at the beginning, and there were naturally more fighters around by the end of the period. But it still just shows in a dynamic way, as a contrast, the demise of the earlier might, especially in controlling the entirety of China. The cavalry, especially, that had been the pride of the Tang military, fell not into disuse. You find these exaggerations sometimes in historiography, but still its training would actually collapse in that more collective and statally controlled sense. There was in a sense, a further senioralization of the system that would produce even some sort of, paradoxically in some cases, more armored infantry retinues that would begin to at least play an important role in the later Tang army as well. They were easier to just field, but they were, of course, not as performing as cavalry, and apparently their collective training wasn't also this big deal of a thing. They were mostly like sort of the local seigneurial retinues, some sort of nobiliar bodyguard, right? And this remains the mainstay until the fall of the Tangs. Of course, the overarching explanation is that the Chinese system at large was not unitary. And this is something I insisted on in other videos. It's sort of easy to intimidate wide masses of peasants into some kind of millenary-old obedience, but it's never that simple when it comes with to the establishment, and the various Tang branches or circuits, as the local districts were known, wouldn't be loyal, nor to the ruling dynasty, nor to one another at some point. Tang China was thus mostly also the product of a broader convergence. It was, for example, also very good at diplomacy, in balancing things out, because also the system internally needed to be, say, kept together with this liminal amount of force, and everything would do. So that we have mostly this period of great prosperity. It's a couple of generations, between 630 and 682. This is also the moment in which Tangs can channel a great deal of their forces into sort of conquest and bringing further wealth into the country by, for example, subduing first the eastern and then the western Gökturks, the two Chua, employing, by the way, many of these as mercenaries, so actually sparing some Chinese from doing the dirty work themselves, also in those hellish places of Central Asia. There's a lot of cooptation, in fact, of these barbarians outside of China proper, but also the frontier is sort of across both systems to an extent. China is very diverse within itself. So before passing to the main battles of the periods, they're just like interesting tales, we can look a bit at Tang arms and armor, right? As we've seen, the armored cavalrymen were really something, as long as the state provided with the adequate means for their sustenance. There is beautiful iconography, as you have watched by this point in the video. We have bas-reliefs from Li Shimin's own tomb in Shaolin. It's a very famous monument in the Shanxi province. And these are essentially armored cavalrymen. At some point you see probably guards of the tomb, and you know they are really elite forces. But at large they would have been, in fact, the spearhead of the Tang's hosts in open field. There was likely certain level of uniformity, because the Tang administration did work well. The Tangs really did work hard to maintain the selection of skilled bureaucratic personnel in the administration in the state. This was necessary to take care, in fact, of the army supplies, etc. And this, say, uniform by early medieval standards, armor would consist of a helmet with leather hood similar to the ones of monks. Then you have the iron cuirass and a skirt that could be, that there were of course different levels of armoredness, but for example this thigh protection could be lamellar in nature. And it was also highly polished. In general, it was all on aesthetics and certain means to even burnish the armor, things we will see better at some other point. For these heavily armored horsemen, of course, a big shield was really unnecessary because the armor would make most of the defense. This is really typical all across the Eurasian steppes, at least influenced world. So a small buckler with iron boss would do to complete the rider's defenses. The Tang armored cavalry weapons would be 3 to 4 meters long cavalry lance, a heavy bow, which shows the degree of specialization that these troops had, like the polyfunctionality. It is very almost Byzantine in its own kind. This derives from, again, intensive training. These are, again, aristocratic forces at large, or at least they're fostered by nobiliar elements, and an element of barbaric exoticism, like still the impact of the steppes of the migration era, of a heavy equestrian culture on still the mostly sedentary Chinese world. All right. So you have the quiver. You would have a secondary weapon of sword. However, this cavalry was able to partially perform both heavy cavalry and also skirmishing archery functions. Then you would have the more typical cavalry with scarcer armor, mostly wearing just a helmet, using a sword and bow. Of course, there would be a spear of some sort. Then you could have several light javelins. Also, this cavalry wouldn't have particularly big shields. A small buckler also in this case would do. Here, the Chinese do not really have a great deal of horse archery other than their tribal auxiliaries from the steppes. So, in part, the Chinese would have to adapt to that. Right? Lots of Turks and Mongols also use light javelins, not just the bow. Actually, the javelins are more performing than the bow, at close range. They're more useful, really. And so that's basically the Chinese response to the steppe in part. And it's okay for dealing with their own forces. Then you would have some kind of heavy infantry that we didn't insist too much on because it was objectively rare in the broader numerical account, but there was presence at the imperial palace and the local headquarters, etc. There are different iconographic sources, even for times that are not precisely Tang, that can do, let's say, around the mid first millennium. There is, for example, a very interesting clay figurine that really does not show, in fact, much differences from the armament of the Three Kingdoms era. We're talking essentially to the Sixth Dynasty. We are, in fact, between the 3rd and the 6th century AD. But it can be really indicative of how these troops really were. China had an old tradition of heavy infantry forces. The Hans had those as well. Cavalry had the upper hand, but you could simply have heavy horsemen dismounting to fight on foot. The spear this heavy infantryman wields is 3 meters long. The shield has this very interesting shape that we find, in fact, also in the previous era, also in the Terracotta Army. Like if you really go back in time, that forms a V shape with the angle, say, opening away from the bearer, however, still providing the largest body coverage. There are 2 grips in the shield that allow to use it either vertically or horizontally, interestingly enough, which suggests also some dynamic fencing capacities connected with some higher training at an individual and collective level for these heavier infantrymen. An average armor for these guys would have been padded or reinforced cloth, if it wasn't just like the same armor of the heavy cavalrymen. There were leather greaves that looked almost like leggings. The Chinese did not really have trousers, but very similar looking to that. Also, of course, every evidence can have some degree of artistic license at the time. Missile troops were important in tank warfare, but mostly connected with the foot, right? We have the very famous drawings from the historian, artist, nobleman Li Pen that would eventually inspire the reliefs in the same tomb of Li Shimin in the Shenxi province that you can look at in the pictures with the running horse. Those were the favorite steeds of the emperor, etc. And this is such an influential figure in Chinese art, right? And sort of espousing, in fact, the same level of achievement of Li Shimin as the greatest emperor that eventually every other ruler would have had to be up to be the perfect sovereign. This archers would be, of course, it would be some sort of heavier armored archers as well, but at large they would be light troops. They would have been armored as well to a degree, like the helmet was there, baggy trousers, quiver. These are characteristics also connected with migration era influence of some sort. Of course, the archery element is coming more from that side of the aisle, and some sort of more comfortable gear was connected in part with steppe styles. We can imagine some degree of color uniformity in the Tang army as well, but mostly depending probably on that at the company or regimental level. Rather, there would have been some favored colors, as we will see, but at large, this depended on smaller units. The tanks did not really have the luxury to spend like any other great military at the time and before enough colors like or dyes to uniform the entire military appearance, especially if we count them in the hundreds of thousands. However, we do know that there was a level of uniformity connected with, for example, the top part of the helmet collar that surely would have allowed these guys to be recognized in combat, at least as part of a specific unit. What would a Tang general look like? Well, heavily armored, of course, expressing this divine power. Shoulder plates, cuirass, greaves, helmet, of course, a lot of ornaments, probably gilded armor to begin with, also an enormous ostentation of power that was typical of the oligarchy of this time. There would be some interesting extra armor, such as leather, likely more often than metal bands, a leather skirt, baggy trousers of sort. He would serve, of course, in quality of a heavy cavalryman, but some more symbolic distinction of power also, ideally against fear, right, of injury, etc., which was in part also a steppe influence. An emperor would have really looked even better, right? A 7th century relief in Lichuan Shenxi province that is actually what allowed for a 14th century copy to be preserved in the National Palace of Taipei, is really a very good illustration of such imperial military attire, right? We have colors here. For example, the yellow robe, right? This seems to have been the imperial color at least since the Tang dynasty. They may have introduced it themselves. The same goes for red, here displayed in the undergarments. It's very colorful. There is a green belt, a black hat, you have streamers, shoes, etc. There's the sacred dragon motif, made a video about at least some aspect of the Chinese imperial tradition connected with that. The dragon motif is repeated on the chest, below the abdomen, in the back, both shoulders, so it's really central to Tang's imperial symbology, like in the broader Chinese one. The dragon itself is blue-gray, bordered with red. The clouds he moves into are colored in white, light blue, light green, and red. This would have been typical colors, also pretty basic ones. Remember those heavier infantrymen of the later Tang period that start to appear at the decline of cavalry, and also because of the gradual collapse of public authority? Well, this can be considered especially from a fresco of the cave number 217 at Tun-huang, dating to 660 AD, showing military training. There is one apparent artistic license, that is to say, again, alleged representation of bare feet for this heavy infantryman. It's possible that this cave fresco deteriorated over time and that such a pale color is nothing but a dilution of a lighter, say, leather color for representing footwear of these soldiers, because otherwise, what would be the point exactly in this training to have bare feet, right? As arms, by the way, which would suggest there that the cuirass was just protecting the torso. In any case, this is in part just a speculation, but it's an interesting picture nevertheless. The headgear of these heavy infantrymen may be a helmet as well as a large loose hood. We see some black robe under the polished iron scales that, as we said before, would be normally well preserved, and from cavalry, and obviously here also by the infantry. There would be some sort of trousers, by this point, at least for the infantry. We see a sword, say 1.7 to 2.1 thrusting spear. You understand here there is a bit less of collective training compared to before. We've seen at least the earlier Tang heavy infantry spearman would be a pikeman of sort, which means that he would be trained to mostly fight in larger formation to be effective. Here the spear is shorter, is evidently a much more sort of thrusting, sort of muscularly thrusting, shorter weapon than the other, more fitting, at least a more individual context. Of course, these weapons were used also in formation, but it seems that here that broader availability of larger collectively collectively trained forces as before was not that available. We see these spears also adorned with the three-pronged banner of the Tang, which is fascinating because, of course, the same imperial military would adequate to these shortcomings at a point, and there is a sense of belonging to the statal cause there. In this case, the banner has a light blue half moon next to the staff, and the rest is black. Then we have some frontal drawing of the unique shield borne by the figures represented. We know that by the end of the 9th century, the Tang Imperial Guard wore white uniforms, which is, again, an interesting indication of this level, of course, of self-representation. There was, of course, cavalry, heavy cavalry in the later Tang era, without saying. However, a bit different from the one we have described before. At least we've talked by average. For the rest, the same types would have existed at large. There are lots of caves connected to the Tun-huang Turks that are also part of this broader Tang military. From an image at the Tun-huang cave number 156, depicting a military procession, we are essentially the mid-9th century. Right? This is the procession of Chang'e Chao. We see the strange banded armor, highly polished. It's not unknown, however, not that frequent either. The helmet is entirely banded too. It's surmounted by a vermilion plume or feather. The length is between 3.6 and 4.5 meters. If anything, it seems that armor became slightly lighter. It's also possible that some, here regardless, it doesn't necessarily have to depict a new type of cavalry compared to the ones that already existed, or necessarily showing some kind of general trend. Right? It's just one example. Actually, here it seems as if cavalry became more sophisticated, even, but we're talking here still some kind of elite. And again, it's possible that even though the sort of regimental cavalry was declining, those lords had also some interestingly strong cavalry on their own, of the elite type that they would foster on their own, but perhaps with less armor. This is yet to be understood, really. We have standards from the later Tang army as well, from the same source as before. Both may be made of leather rather than what was the customary cloth, so painted leather. Standards carried by cavalry units. They may have not even been part of the Tang imperial army, but just of some local magnate of sort. We see different colors: black, buff, black, white in alternation, or darker green or black. But this again may just depend on the individual source and not much else. Passing to battles, there is a lot of military history in the Tang era, fortunately recorded and available, so that today's video is just like, again, the minimal introduction to the era. Some battles are also probably to be further researched. I will surely at some point address them. We will at some point talk more about Chinese warfare in general. Some battles are also difficult to chronologically pinpoint because Chinese historiography is again not overwhelmingly precise at times, but we've seen that this is actually the same for more obscure periods. We saw that, for example, even about the Romano-Persian wars at the time of Heraclius. There is also, in fact, at this same time going on in the West. There is the Battle of the Spring of Yinma in 617. This is a struggle between the Sui and the Tang forces, the latter emerging victorious. Essentially, the Sui, commanded by the general Sang Hsien-ho, sent a vanguard in force attempting to cross the ford at the Yin-ma Springs. These are sort of marshy areas that it's properly like some different islands and separated by water, and it's sort of difficult to pass, needless to say, for an army. So this vanguard is tasked with, scouting for suitable fording. That at Yin-ma Spring is defended by the Tang light cavalry that held position, while a force of Göktürk auxiliary cavalry, the Tanai, made their way around the Sui forces, attacking the vanguard from the rear. This attack on two fronts brings to the collapse of the Sui. This is a good example of combined armed tactics, but also of so we're talking light cavalry, of course, in the sense that it was lighter than the heavier one, but mostly they were heavier than the Turkic auxiliaries. And it shows you how, in fact, like you can hold some difficult ground even with lighter forces that can be combative enough to hold, to keep the enemy at bay, fundamentally. Then we have the Battle of Ulao, that is really one of the most epic pages in Li Shimin's curriculum. This battle occurred on May the 28th, 621, pivotal military engagement during the tumultuous period of transition from the Sui to the Tang dynasty. This battle also was part of the broader war known as the Luoyang-Ulao campaign, where contention for Chinese dominance among various powers was fierce. You have from one side the Tang led by the prince at the time Li Shimin, and the Xia regime commanded by Du Jiande. In the years leading up to the battle, the Sui dynasty had deteriorated significantly, primarily due to the disastrous military campaigns against Korea that had absorbed so many resources. Some say also there had been natural disasters. However, humans can't really mess up things politically much better than any sort of environmental reason, leading also, by the way, to the widespread unrest among the populace because of this enormous effort and the general shortcut. By 618, local governors and military leaders began to assert their power. Among them was Li Yuan, the Duke of Tang, who established a stronghold in Taiyuan and eventually claimed imperial throne, becoming the founder of the Tang dynasty. This is really the background to also the previous battle. His son Li Shimin was a skilled military leader and critical figure, as we've seen in expanding Tang influence. By 619, two notable rivals had emerged. In the northeastern plains, Wang Shichong, a former Sui general and self-proclaimed emperor of the Zheng dynasty based in Luoyang, and Du Jiande, former bandit leader turned king of Xia. So the Zheng and the Xia were essentially the major rivals to the Tang in their ascent at the expenses of the Sui, that in part, again, were all part of the system. Both rulers posed significant threats to the Tang's ambitions, and this is how fundamentally things escalated as each polity sought to expand their territories amidst the decaying remnants of Sui authority. In August 620, Li Shimin initiated a campaign against the Zheng dynasty, quickly besieging Luoyang, where Wang Shichong was holed up. Following failed attempts at breaking the siege, Wang requested assistance from Duao Jiande. In response, Du gathered an enormous army estimated to be between 100 and 120,000 troops. Naturally, it's an exaggeration, and marched westwards to confront the Tang forces and relieve Luoyang. What's important here is that we're talking about regional scale forces. This, by the way, is a typical evidence of the normal historiographical numerical inflation of armies, especially when we're talking about, the terrible foe that has so many troops, and the heroic tanks now are outnumbered, whatever. They were outnumbered, but of course not by that much. Li Shimin, rather than retreating, this was really very much to his credit, opted to maintain the siege while sending a portion of his troops to the strategically significant Hulao Pass. This is similar to the Thermopylae, if you look at it strategically, a choke point vital for controlling, for control really, movement and communications all across the country. This decision reflected Li's strategic acumen, as abandoning the siege would free Du to strengthen his holds on the northeastern plains, jeopardizing Tang's overall ambition. Hence the motivation behind the resistance. As weeks passed, both sides engaged in strategic posturing. The Tang refused to confront Du's larger forces outside their entrenched position, creating a stalemate. Meanwhile, Du's forces struggled with logistical challenges, as maintaining a large army in the field drained resources and morale. At the end of May 621, seeking to break the deadlock, Li Shimin executed a calculated plan. He feigned a retreat, drawing Du's attention. On the morning of May the 28th, confident in his numerical superiority, Du arrayed his army for battle. The Tang army, in a show of discipline and strategy, refrained from leaving their strong defensive positions. As they progressed, Du's forces grew weary from waiting and the sweltering heat. Li observed the signs of fatigue in the Xia troops. Timing his assault carefully, he launched tactical cavalry charge, initially sending a probing force against the disorganized Xia soldiers, exacerbating their lack of cohesion and increasing their sense of vulnerability. Realizing the moment was ripe, Li Shimin ordered a full-scale engagement. The Tang cavalry struck decisively against the Xia flanks, leading to chaos among Du's ranks. While Du attempted to rally his troops, poor communication and disarray rendered his efforts ineffective. The Tang forces pushed mercilessly, and amidst the fighting, Du was wounded and captured, symbolizing the collapse of Xia's military force. In the aftermath of the clash, the Xia suffered severe losses, with around 3,000 soldiers killed on the battlefield, while more than 50,000 allegedly were taken as prisoners. This clamorous Tang victory not only dismantled Du Zhanda's leadership, but also led to the detachment of significant factions that had rallied under the Xia regime. The immediate consequence of the Battle of Wulao was the surrender of Wang Shichong in early June, prompted by the news of the Xia's defeat, and the sight of Du's captured forces displayed before the city walls. This sequence of events resulted in the Tang dynasty seizing control over the vital northeastern plains of China that were where most of, in fact, imperial power rested on. The battle significantly altered the political landscape of the time. It marked the decline of both Zheng and Xia regimes. That's why we're talking about this beyond the strictly military aspect in such detail. Du Zhanda and Wang Shichong were executed shortly after the battle, illustrating the Tang's determination to eliminate any potential rivals completely. The Tang's victory at Wulao thus paved the way for their eventual unification of China, which they accomplished by 628. So historians regard the Battle of Wulao as one of the most decisive engagements during the civil wars following the Sui dynasty's collapse. It solidified the Tang dynasty power and the stage for its emergence as a dominant force in Chinese history. Li Shimin's leadership, as you understand, is matched by his tactical genius displayed in this battle, which established his reputation as a formidable commander, but later catapulted him to the throne as Emperor Taizong, right? Li Shimin is the personal name, right? Under whom the Tang dynasty saw this unprecedented cultural and territorial expansion, also through the victories we will list now. And so this is a widely celebrated historical event and military victory, heralded as the consolidation of power, which would influence the entire China for centuries to come. Then we have other clashes that are less relevant in comparison to this, but not sort of less fascinating, also from a tactical point of view. Some of the stratagems are surprising as legendary, such as the one employed by the Tangs at the Battle of Kansu in 623. At this time, the Tangs were countering an invasion by the Tun-huang Hans. We will see this Turkic people molesting China from the west. General Chai Shao was sent with an army into the mountainous terrain in the province of Kansu, only to find himself surrounded by the steppes enemy forces. The commander notices a small isolated knoll that is actually just in front of the Hannik array, well visible, so that Chai Shao orders two scantily clad girls to climb up onto this hill. These women start performing some sort of bizarre and enticing dances and gestures that are uniquely obscene and provocative, singing lewd songs, by the way, so just in front of the barbarian Huns. This is fascinating because, like, these women were likely just, I don't know whether they would have been selected from, I don't know, some similar Hannik friends or whatever, but it's also like you must really have a courage to, as two women, just to start doing this in front of a Hannik army, right? Just not really very advised for the women. But as far as the Tangs are concerned, the trick worked, at least according to the notion here. God only knows what actually happened in this battle, and let's hope that these women, at least emerged unscathed from this. In any case, the Huns are completely ensnared by these sirens, and they break their ranks as fools to approach the hill where these dancers were performing in order to see them better from close. And the Tang armies quickly descended down the other side of the hill onto the enemy rear, which gives way, causing the rout of the entire Hannik force. Right? So this battle account can be interpreted as a broader philosophical appreciation typical of the Oriental sensitivity, focusing on obviously the moral aspect of the story. Like, if you're fighting a battle, don't get distracted by other things. It's just a very useful tip, and it's interesting to imagine that the Huns would have just fallen for this alluring bait. Then there is the Battle of Kuchan, 644. Again, I made a video about Kuchan warfare, which is very interesting for a number of reasons. It's technically connected. I think the etymology is the same of Kushan, really. And in fact, there was an Indo-Scythian connection as well. Again, we will, I made a video about that too, so you can check that out, but we'll also come back on the topic at a point. This is the moment in which the Tang dynasty manages to re-extend Chinese control over the Tarim basin that had already been, as you know, hegemonized from the east in the past, which unavoidably triggers the climatic battle against the more powerful city-state of the region, that is Kucha. The forces of which apparently consisted of armored cavalry. There's a lot of steppe influence, and these city-states would have maintained some kind of Iranian or Tokharian legacy, plus now reinforced. We're in 644, like by a lot of actual Turkic, also Chinese influence from before. We do not know too much, except that this host is commanded by the Kuchen king, Holy Pu-shi-pi, at least in the Chinese description, which means divine flower. The Tang army was commanded at this point by a Turkic general, at least a general of Turkic ancestry that was, of course, familiar with the region, Ashi na Shoeul. The army consisted also of Chinese regulars, plus the Tuchue Turkic allies, and the Tölech, that would be the Uyghur Turks. So you have quite an interesting mix there. We still have to talk about Uyghur warfare. We'll do it at some point soon. The Chinese used this favorite Xiongnu tactic of the feign route, right, to essentially be chased by the Kuchen army that, being heavier, is also going to be worn out. It's really sort of plausible in the general context. You imagine also the beautiful landscape of this, the flat Tarim basin, with, however, a few river courses with all this, mountainous skyline, and the relentless advance of this heavier, more disciplined Kushan elite that, however, is also not like a fully fledged, like a regional force, by these storms of howling Turkic horse archers. This is one instance in which the heavier forces do fall into the trap, because the Kuchan army, apparently, again, it's very complicated to reconstruct on the basis of these accounts, like what happened. It's just some anecdotal evidence, like Central Asian first half of the 7th century battles, right? Would they been 17th century battles, it would be very difficult to reconstruct. But this was a major engagement, and so apparently the Kuchan get themselves into this uncontrolled pursuit because they are provoked really by the foes. They would have had lighter cavalry themselves. However, they were heavier, and once they are out in the open, they're ultimately surrounded and subdued. Right? So they really fall for it, and they eventually collapse when attacked in the trap by all these forces combined. In the same year, you have the Battle of Hsien-ch'eng. It's a major clash between the Tangs and the Koreans that displays the tendentially greater Chinese mobility compared to the latter forces. According to the account, there is this Korean army of 150,000, which is, again, a gross fantasy, right? Not even exaggeration, but a gross fantasy. Apparently, these Koreans had a very few armored cavalry. The Koreans had actually very solid elite cataphracts of some sort, but it is true that they had just a very few of that. They were a bit more of a feudal and castellated reality. Again, we discussed Korean warfare is quite fascinating. And the protagonist here is Li Shi-min. You see, he sends his Turkic generals to command Chinese forces subduing the Kuchan. This is the moment of peak of glory, of the Tang dynasty, and the guy takes care of Korea that tends to destabilize the Chinese northeast. That is a bit, of course, so crucial also for maritime connections, for the contact with the steppes and so on. Li Shimin's army is of 30,000, which instead seems to be very plausible. It would be, in this time in history, as we were saying before, the pretty accurately solid, largest amount of of troops you can field even as a major imperial power like the Tangs. We are in a decentralized fringe area. The enemy is fighting at home, but this does not mean that he can field so much. It's Tang China against Korea. And so likely the Koreans may have been around the same force, and if they were actually more numerically, it's not because they were qualitatively superior, and so also the chances there would have been that larger numbers would have been not really there. Also, the Koreans were not so cohesive as a force at large, politically wise. So the Korean left flank and rear are hidden by the mountains. We described this battle also in the video about Korean warfare, of course. So what Hsien-chih does is throwing 15,000 troops ahead, so half of his force, to pin the Koreans, to engage them. Predictably, at this point, it's an outflanking maneuver that will settle the matter, especially considering that the Koreans do not have so much cavalry just to prevent the whole operation to be attempted, at least. Hsien-chih has 4,000 of his picked armored cavalry as a reserve. Changsu Wu-chi, that is a Chinese wing commander, as we've seen, is one of the most prestigious, of course, ranks in the army, has 11,000 men. So altogether, these are the other 15,000, so it's half of the tank force that attempts this double envelopment, which really is one of the most difficult tactics to perform, especially to coordinate, especially in the first half of 7th century Korea, even by the very drilled tank military that here really shows the peak of its quality. So the point is to work around like the Korean flank and effect a rear attack. So Hsien-chih's cavalry attacks the Korean right flank. These are fewer troops. A flank attack is always a terrible thing to suffer, but if we assume that the Koreans were so many and so bulky and also like stubborn, sturdy forces, like there would have been a very intense fight, and Hsien-chih needs to rely on these 4,000 men to be the bait. Has at least there is the bulk of say half of the forces that pins them frontally, and this flank attack already, for the fact that it's successfully performed, it's a major stress for the Koreans that have to start fighting on two flanks. And at this point, while the forces are properly positioned, a smoke signal announces the attack of Wuchi wing. The Chinese, of course, have it all sorted out before. And this larger force, flanking force, falls on the Korean rear. And so this basically destroys the Korean army, allegedly causing 20,000 Korean dead and 36,000 captives. It's an exaggeration, but it does definitely signal mission accomplished. This is very, very, very interesting because a double enveloping maneuver plus with half of the army is something insane in terms of actual quality, capacity, effort, leadership, coordination for especially like a 7th century army. It really shows how good Hsien-chih was, especially as a leader, and also how qualitative the Tang army really was. The Koreans here are without adequate cavalry, apparently. However, they would have had something, at least in reserve, as we said before, and they weren't enough to stop this force. But likely it were also much less than, of course, what the Chinese say. Because these are the stupid barbarians of the situation, of course. And so they must be big, many, and stupid for some reason. But it wasn't like that, really. Now, we mentioned before this little excursus literally excursus in India, which happens when Tang army, supported by Turkic auxiliaries, had swept the Tarim Basin, as well as the Gobi Desert, of different enemies, including the Topa. These were all Turkic tribes that had also been profiting of the demise of the Tocharians, etc. We are in 649, so as we've seen, 5 years after the aforementioned battles in the Tarim Basin and Korea. And so while the Allied army is coming back, because we're essentially in Tibet, in Nepal, so coming back towards China from probably the Asian hinterland, they decide to essentially enforce previous treaty that had been signed by the King Alanashan of Chapra, that is on the Ganges River, who had promised China through this agreement essentially some aid, some support. This is interesting because it tells you how, of course, powerful the Tangs were internationally at that point. And since this Indian ruler thought, haha, I'm behind the Himalaya, nobody will ever do anything against me. Actually, a force of 1,200 Tibetan heavy knights, because the Tibetans are a hell of a traumatically shocking feudal military culture, plus 7,000 Nepalese infantry, they're pretty darn good mountaineers, were sent on a punitive expedition against a guy that is literally abducted as a prisoner, exemplifying that, the Tang heavenly rulers of Qin, really, so everything really under heaven, under themselves, could simply pick an Indian king and deport him at their will, and not even having to do it themselves, but using their servants, basically, that would accomplish the mission thanks to the Chinese imperium there. So I think that this is pretty sketchy, but overall interesting introduction. Of course, it's such enormous topic. If you look about what we know about the Tang military, it's utterly insane. And this is true for most of Chinese warfare. That's the reason why I decided to start this introduction that will have to lead us a bit more distant from this, because I will at some point finish these introductions but unavoidably get into something more in depth. You can't really unhave it to a point. Our goal to cover the entire military history of the world, is of course, always there. It's a bit difficult to achieve, to attain, but if we go step by step, we can actually get there. And creating, especially this is what I'm very fascinated with, especially with Eurasia, this sort of path, this bridge, this labyrinth, but also kind of overview from essence to detail of this continuum that you understand existing across these continents. Then, of course, we will talk about lots of other things. You understand here the cultural factors being crucial, also the political and social fundamentals, what is interesting about comparative history, because there are those classes at university. World history now will tell you, in a few tenths of classes, the entire history of the world and what have you. Yeah, good luck with that. Good luck of having people understanding. Well, it's better than nothing, of course, but it's not like you can really pretend this explanation to be how you study the history of the world. You have to do it by also concentrating on just in some parts, but having in that sense the capacity of seeing by depth what could be going on in other systems at the same time. And comparing Europe to China is never easy, but it's actually easier than it may seem. So that's why we're pursuing that, showing that it's feasible, and also getting somewhere with it in strictly historical terms, what we can squeeze out of it, which of course is always what you're doing the whole thing for. I have, by this point, let me check how many videos I made about China. I think I haven't created a playlist about China yet, which is insane, because it's such a big topic. We didn't talk about Chinese warfare strictly speaking too much, but we began really to talk about a lot of Asian warfare that unavoidably intertwines with the Chinese one, except for India at large. Today we saw one exception, but as a whole, China, at least that's the exception in turn also. China messes up practically everybody. So let me check if I made something about China specifically. Yeah. I made Chinese warfare playlist. It was a recent one. Let's see how many people watch. Probably not many, because, well, for 6 videos, which is too few in fact, 135 views. Oh. I'm glad we make these blocks, because here what we really did about China, aside from the Mongol period, is just a part of Han warfare and a part of Zhou warfare at large. And then we made the Khitan, the Liao, but that's kind of another thing. And this is yet another chapter, and again, it does feel too few, but it's better than nothing, and it's also healthy, let's say, to just having gotten there attentively. I hope this playlist, of course, to quickly grow. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.